10 years. He then specialized in forensic pathology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. After that, he was a specialist forensic pathologist then in Durban. And then we were here to welcome him when he moved to Cape Town in 2008. He's currently the clinical head, unit head of forensic pathology services in the Western Cape. That's for the West Metropole, Cape Town West Metropole. And he's a senior lecturer in my department in forensic medicine and toxicology here at UCT. Now, Dr. Cook is one of our most experienced forensic pathologists at Salt River Mortuary. He's performed more than 6,000 forensic post-mortem investigations and examinations. So I'm leaving you in the hands of a person who have, I won't say seen it all, because we get surprised, believe it or not, still on a daily basis. But I'm leaving you in the hands of a highly experienced forensic pathologist and a person with a vast experience of post-mortems. So Dr. Kirk.
Right, well, thanks to Dr. Haynes for that introduction. As you see, our topic today, the what, where, when and how of post-mortems, which is quite a broad topic. So when I tried to narrow it down, I had to confine myself largely to the forensic post-mortem, which is really my field of expertise. So that's where I'll be concentrating on. But I thought we'd start off just by looking at how we've got to where we are. And if we go back to 44 BC, and as you're all aware, Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators on the 14th of March, 44 BC. And we're told that his corpse was examined by a Roman physician by the name of Antistius. And Antistius determined that Caesar had been stabbed 23 times. There were apparently more than 40 assailants, so they didn't all get a shot in. But of these 23 wounds, Antistius determined that one stab wound to the chest penetrated the aorta, and he determined that as the cause of death. We don't know anything about how he examined the body. We can be pretty certain that he didn't dissect the body. It was just by looking at it externally. But he attributed the death to blood loss from the stab wound. So this was one of the first recorded instances that we know of essentially a forensic post-mortem examination. There are three terms that are quite commonly used to describe this examination of a corpse after death: a post-mortem examination, an autopsy, or a necropsy. And they all are really interchangeable. They mean essentially the same thing, but they sometimes, in some circumstances, do have different implications. Post-mortem examination, literally just an examination after death, tends to be used quite commonly for both just an external inspection of a dead body, or the process of dissecting a dead body, whereas autopsy, from the Greek to see for oneself, usually is used more in the instance where there is a dissection or opening of the body to examine it. Necropsy, or to see death, some people use it for the post-mortem examination of animals, but there's no real reason why that should be the case. But all three terms are used largely interchangeably. Looking further back in history, as far as autopsy in terms of dissecting bodies go, for a long period of history and even to this day, there are many social or religious beliefs that are against the dissection of the body, as seen as a form of mutilation. And although we know the ancient Egyptians removed organs as part of their embalming process, they did it through small incisions, and it wasn't to inspect the organs or to inspect the innards of the body at all. In Greece in the 3rd century BC, have amongst the first records of human dissections being done. This led also to human bodies being dissected at the Great Library in Alexandria, and it was largely to study anatomy, maybe a little bit about human function, but the beliefs were still very much in terms of body function and disease being caused by, or the disturbance of the body function leading to disease being disturbance of the humors or the effects of magic or spells or that kind of thing. The first recorded human dissection in China was in the year 16 AD, and one of the first people we know by name that, sorry, I'm not used to this remote and got the wrong button. One of the first people we know by name that had an autopsy was a member of Japanese royalty who committed suicide, and an autopsy was done in the year 456. As part of the, when there was outbreaks of plague, both in Byzantium in the year 543 and later, almost 800 years later, Pope Clement VI authorized autopsies on plague or Black Death victims to try and ascertain what was causing the deaths. Frederick II, who was Holy Roman Emperor, he promulgated the first law that authorized human dissection way back in 1231. But it was only really in the Renaissance period that human dissections really flourished in terms of a more scientific approach to the study of anatomy and physiology. Also for artistic reasons, many of the Renaissance artists dissected bodies to study the anatomy, because somebody like Leonardo da Vinci covered both of those fields. There was that time in the Renaissance also saw really the dawn of medical dissections, and there were dissections became public spectacles, and you'd have a lecture hall, something like this, with a body being dissected and the professor sitting in his chair up above and his minions doing the work, and the public observing and learning about the human body. When it comes to the autopsy in pathology or the study of disease, it's a relatively recent innovation, and from really the middle of the 19th century, and two of the great pioneers in pathology, Rokitansky and, by the end of this I should get used to this remote, Rokitansky and Virchow, who used the autopsy of human dissection to study disease processes and the changes that were occurring from normal anatomy, combined with the development of the light microscope and microscopic study of pathology. Really, it's on that basis that the science of pathology today has been built. Sir William Osler, a great Canadian physician and medical educator, he was a great proponent of using the autopsy or body dissections as well as the autopsy in teaching medical students. So what is now standard practice that medical students use human cadavers to learn anatomy. In some instances nowadays it's done virtually rather than on real cadavers, but here at UCT we still use real cadavers. And when students are studying pathology, also the pathology is demonstrated in the autopsy room. By the middle of the 20th century, the autopsy had become as really a standard part of pathology practice, and autopsy rates in many parts of the world, including South Africa, the United States, and Europe, were around about 50%. So in other words, about 50% of people who died in hospital in the mid-20th century would have an autopsy done. Since then, the autopsy rates, really from about the late 1960s, 1970s, autopsy rates worldwide started declining rapidly. And if you were to die in a hospital today, the chances of you having an autopsy done would be somewhere between 1% and 5%. So it's become much rarer, to the extent that doctors who are studying pathology and require a certain number of autopsies to perform a certain number of autopsies before they can write their pathology exams. Nowadays it's quite a struggle to actually get those numbers done. This doesn't include what I'm going to go on to talking about the forensic autopsy, because what determines whether somebody has a forensic autopsy, as we'll see shortly, is quite different. Is it a problem that autopsy rates have declined? Well, those of us who practice autopsies think so. So what are the benefits of autopsies? And they're multifold. To physicians and healthcare, the autopsy can reveal misdiagnoses. Physicians can learn from that. They get more precise information about the conditions that cause their patient to die. To the family of the deceased, it can give more precise information again, which may help with closure. The detection of some conditions that are heritable, genetic factors, can be of benefit to surviving next of kin who can have preventative measures taken. To public health in terms of determining risk factors. It's unlikely that the campaigns against smoking, or the link of smoking to lung cancer and other diseases would have developed to the state it is now without the autopsy. To medical education and medical research, well, they're really invaluable in those regards. And then to law enforcement and justice, which is what I'm going to be speaking about further, in terms of providing information for the justice system. So why have autopsy rates, other than medical legal autopsies, declined to such an extent? Well, there seems to be a lot of social pressure against autopsies, seen as that the person who's now died is going to suffer further and suffer disfigurement, etc. There's also a declined demand from medical practitioners who've become somewhat overconfident in clinical diagnoses now, with the development of more and more laboratory tests with better imaging systems. However, when one looks at causes of death that are given on clinical diagnoses, there's still an error rate of around about 30% at this day. So 30% of the time the cause of death that is given by a clinician is actually incorrect to some degree, or sometimes to a greater degree than others, but there's some inaccuracy. So I certainly believe that the autopsy still has great benefits. An author by the name of Edward Gall, back in the 1960s, this is when autopsies were still very much in their heyday, said that, wrote that despite the disparagement of the ignorant and the patronizing smiles of the sophisticated, the necropsy still moves along at its time-honored steady pace, maintaining standards, contributing to knowledge, and even on occasion stimulating the sluggard. So, right, I've mentioned now two different types of autopsy, the so-called hospital autopsy and then the medical legal autopsy. The hospital autopsy is the one that its rate has declined rapidly, and that's the type of autopsy that's done on somebody who dies from natural causes. In our law, and if we look at post-mortems around the world, obviously they're controlled by law, so laws differ from country to country. So cases that would require medical legal autopsy in South Africa may not necessarily require medical legal autopsy, for example, in Germany. We'll come to what those criteria are, but just for example, if you die in a motor vehicle collision in South Africa, the law stipulates that you must have a medical legal autopsy. If you die in a motor vehicle collision in Germany, it's not necessarily so. But as far as the so-called diagnostic or hospital autopsy, these are people who die of natural causes. This is controlled by the National Health Act, and consent for it is required from either the deceased person themselves, obviously before they die. They can give consent to a post-mortem being done after death, or the next of kin requires to give consent. There are some other categories, some other laws where post-mortems can be done where it's authorized by the Minister of Health, for example, in the interests of health, if it's a suspected contagious disease, etc. But for the most part, it falls under here, so it's up to the next of kin to give that consent. Doctors often don't like asking for that consent, so that's one hindrance. Families will sometimes refuse. Also, these post-mortems somebody has to pay for them. So if it's done in the private sector, the family has to pay, and they're not cheap. If you die in a public hospital, the hospital has to pay the National Laboratory Service to perform the autopsy, and hospital managers are very, they struggle a lot with their budgets nowadays, so those are some of the reasons why the rates have declined. However, when it comes to the medical legal autopsy, there's a law that stipulates that the examination must take place. As far as the cost goes, that's carried by the state. The law that covers this is an old law called the Inquest Act, dates back from 1959, and it stipulates that a post-mortem examination is to be performed on all deaths from other than natural causes. Now, it doesn't stipulate what is meant by post-mortem examination, the extent of that examination, but it does say that it has to be performed by an authorized person. An authorized person is somebody who's employed by the state to carry out that function. So they have to be a medical practitioner, not necessarily a specialist in the field, because there are not enough specialists to go around in the country, but they have to be employed for that purpose. The consent of the next of kin is not required to perform the post-mortem. The consent actually comes from the magistrate of the district in which the death occurs. And the law also gives the person performing the autopsy quite a wide scope. It allows you to take any specimen that may lead to a more accurate establishment of the cause of death, and you may retain any such specimen. So that could be, sorry, yes. I'm coming to that, yes. They didn't used to be, but now fortunately they are. So specimens may range from taking a blood sample or a urine sample from the body to taking little biopsies of tissues to retaining whole organs, which is sometimes necessary to establish the cause of death. Different countries have different systems. Our system, because of our history, is derived largely from English law. Although our legal system is largely Roman Dutch, our court systems are essentially derived largely from English law. King Athelson, who was King of Wessex in the year 925, appointed somebody by the name of St. John of Beverley as the keeper of the pleas of the crown. And his job was to inquire where, when, and by what means a person came to his death. Now, St. John, this keeper of the pleas of the crown, was not a medical person or a legal person. He was actually part of the king's treasury, because the law at the time was that if you died at your own hand, if you died as a result of suicide, then all your estate was forfeited to the crown. So the crown had a major interest in identifying suicides, because it was a major source of income to them. Shakespeare refers to the crowner as seeing in investigating Ophelia's death, whether she drowned, whether the water came to Ophelia or Ophelia to the water, something to that extent. So this keeper of the pleas of the crown became known as a crowner, and from that became a coroner, which is still the system that is in use in the UK today. We don't have coroners in South Africa, but our system is very similar to the colonial system. We have magistrates who conduct the inquests into the deaths. So again, it's this Inquest Act that provides for the procedures that are followed in all cases where deaths are due to other than apparent natural causes. And in the Inquest Act, it says that any person who has reason to believe that a death is not due to natural causes can report it to a policeman. When it comes to medical practitioners, I'll come to the medical practitioners, natural and unnatural death in a moment, but just to say, how are these deaths investigated now in South Africa? We have forensic pathology service established in each province. This was in terms of the National Health Act, and from the year 2006, forensic pathology services were established as provincial competencies within departments of health. Before that, the forensic pathology mortuaries were police mortuaries. They were staffed and manned by policemen, but the post-mortem examinations were done by doctors or pathologists employed by the Department of Health, but they were administered and run by the police. 2006, that moved from the police service to the provincial departments of health. So, as with all the other provinces, in 2006, the Western Cape Forensic Pathology Service was established, and it now has 18 forensic pathology facilities around the province. The two big ones being in the metropole of Cape Town, Salt River Mortuary, which falls under the department at UCT, and then the Tygerberg Mortuary, which falls under the Stellenbosch University department. Just to give you an idea, this is one of the two Cape Town Metropole facilities, Salt River, and the number of cases done per year. You'll see last year we did, I think the figure was something like 3,823, somewhere in that range. As you can see, it was our busiest year since I have records from the year 2000. Of course, that's partly because the population is increasing, but we've also seen really a steady increase, and that's been largely in homicides and violent crimes, gang-related crimes over the last 5 or 6 years. And very similar figures at Tygerberg. Tygerberg are now a slightly busier mortuary than we are at Salt River. It used to be the other way around. But so in the Cape Town metropole, we are seeing around in the region of 8,000 unnatural deaths a year. Right. As we saw earlier, any person, any member of the public can report a death as being suspicious if they think it's not due to natural causes. When it comes to medical practitioners, a medical practitioner who is filling out a death notification form, whenever anybody dies, then a doctor needs to complete a death notification form in which they identify the person and say what the cause of death is. And one of the other things they have to do is to tick one of these two boxes. Either that they say that they satisfied the death was solely and exclusively due to natural causes, or that they're unable to say that. So if they say the death is due to natural causes, then we are not involved. So then an autopsy may be performed, but it will be under the National Health Act and with the consent of the next of kin. It is not legally required. And a death certificate is issued, the body can then be buried or cremated or whatever the case may be. However, if this box is ticked, then it has to be reported to the police. And the police have to open a case, either an inquest case, or if it's an obvious crime, they would open a murder case, for example. And those cases, all those cases then fall under the jurisdiction of the Forensic Pathology Service. So those bodies will be taken to the closest forensic pathology mortuary, and the examination would commence there. So what are these unnatural deaths? Up until a few years ago, they were not legally defined except for one case which was that if you died under the influence of an anesthetic, the law determined that that death wasn't a natural death, whatever the anesthetic was being given for. That law has now been changed, but there are now 4 categories that the law defines as being unnatural. Where there's an application of some form of force, where there's an act of omission or commission, a procedure-related death, which has replaced that so-called anesthetic death, and unexpected or unexplained deaths. So just to look at each of those, by far the majority of cases that we see as unnatural deaths fall into this category. There's been some application of a force in the broadest terms of what that means. So it may be a mechanical force. What in many areas has become the traditional South African weapon now, the motor vehicle, is responsible for, as far as the single categories go, the largest number of cases that we see. Homicides like gunshots, stab wounds, assaults, accidental force like falling and hitting your head on the pavement, forces of nature like being struck by lightning, other electrical forces like electrocution, cases like drowning, exposure, heat exposure, cold exposure, all those sort of things would fall under this category of external factors. And also, importantly, direct or indirect, with or without complications. So it doesn't mean that if you get a neck injury sustained, say, in a stab wound of the neck, and you don't die there and then from it, but 5 years later, because of the neck injury, the person is paraplegic and they require repeated catheterizations of the bladder, and they develop infections which ascend to the kidneys and eventually destroy the kidneys, and they die of kidney failure. That would remain an unnatural death, because the initiating thing that started the whole process off was that stab wound to the neck. So it's whatever the initial process is. Acts of omission or commission can be a little bit more difficult to determine, but it's deaths that would usually be regarded as from natural causes, but because somebody's done something they shouldn't have done, or they haven't done something they should have done, it can make it an unnatural death. So somebody who dies of pneumonia, that would generally be considered a natural death. But let's say the person is admitted to hospital with pneumonia and their treatment is prescribed, but somebody in the ward decides they don't like this person, so they don't give them their antibiotics. Now, that would clearly be an act of omission. So it would render what would normally be a natural death to one that would be unnatural. Sudden and unexpected deaths mostly are due to natural causes, but because they're sudden and unexpected, and most importantly also unexplained, until one investigates a little bit further and can't make that determinant. So this is often a younger person that dies suddenly without any particular medical history. And more often than not, we will find some underlying heart disease or brain condition or something like that that's led to the death and as natural causes, but without that investigation, we simply don't know. And then the final category are procedure-related deaths. The old Section 56 of the Health Professions Act was the bit that said that if you died under the influence of an anesthetic, it was unnatural. Now the law has been broadened to the extent that it's actually quite problematic, because no one really knows what this law means. It says the death of a person undergoing or as a result of a procedure of therapeutic, diagnostic or palliative nature, or of which any aspect of such a procedure has been a contributory cause, shall not be deemed to be a death from natural causes. The problem is that the law doesn't tell us what it understands by being a procedure. So is having your blood pressure taken a procedure? If you having your blood pressure taken with a blood pressure cuff and you're busy dying of a heart attack, does that make it unnatural? It would seem logically no, but it depends how you interpret the law. So this law is being re-looked at now, but that's how it stands at the moment. We tend to interpret it as being talking about invasive sorts of procedures. Just to mention the so-called shipment factor, because as you saw, it's up to a medical practitioner who's filling out the death notification form to determine whether this death is going to be investigated or not. And so it's largely medical practitioners who are the gatekeepers of the system. That's in cases that are obvious unnatural deaths, so somebody who's been shot or has fallen off Table Mountain or something like that, and the body is recovered. Those clearly wouldn't require a medical practitioner to make that determination. But Harold Shipman, for those of you who don't remember, he was a GP in Yorkshire in the UK, and is the most prolific mass murderer in British history. He murdered, we know of 215 of his patients. That's the inquiry held by Dame Janet Smith after he was convicted. He was convicted of, if I remember correctly, 13 or 14 murders, but the inquiry later found that he definitely killed 215 and possibly as many as 260 of his patients. And he got away with it for as long as he did because he was filling in the death certificates saying natural causes. Mostly these were elderly patients, and although they were mostly relatively healthy, it was the deaths were somewhat unexpected, but the families accepted what their family GP told them. Meanwhile, he was actually injecting them with heroin. We don't know his motive still. He took that with him to the grave. It was a year after he was imprisoned, he committed suicide by hanging himself in prison. He was only caught because in one of the cases he forged the will of one of his patients, and the family became suspicious when their aunt had now suddenly bequeathed her house to Shipman. But anyway, the problem is that there are really no safeguards to prevent such a thing happening in our legal system. Our system relies on the integrity of the medical practitioner who's filling out the form. And well, I'm sure in 99.9% of cases that's a justified confidence to have. We don't know about that very small percentage that might be lurking out there. Okay, so the inquest is really what medical legal postmortems fall under. So we perform the postmortem to fulfill the requirements of the inquest. And what an inquest determines, and inquests, incidentally, are held in all cases of unnatural deaths, except where there's a criminal charge being laid. So if there's a criminal case and somebody appears in charge in court about that death, then the inquest would fall away. But if whatever the circumstances, whether it is a murder or a car accident, and no one's been charged in relation to that death, then an inquest would be held, usually by a magistrate, occasionally by a judge. But what the inquest has to determine is the identity of the deceased. Now, depending on the type of case, some of these things will be obvious and some might be more challenging. So if you have a bus carrying 50 passengers that crashes and bursts into flames and all 50 people are charred beyond recognition, then the cause of death is not really so much an issue as the identity of the deceased. But in most circumstances, the identity is not a problem. The date of death may be an issue where it's a skeleton found in the forest somewhere, but again, usually not a problem. The cause of death will hopefully be determined by the post-mortem examination. Sometimes the date, the identity also requires investigations from the post-mortem, and then whether any person or persons may be liable for the death. So at the inquest, no one's on trial, there's no accused person, but the inquest may determine that somebody should be held responsible, and the case may be referred to the DPP, the public prosecutor, for example, or the case may be referred to a professional body like the Health Professions Council if the inquest magistrate feels there's evidence of malpractice. So what does the autopsy involve? The aims of the forensic autopsy are will vary from case to case, but establishing identity, again, usually that's not an issue. In most circumstances, the identification of the deceased is done in the same way as we identify people every day, by looking at their faces and recognizing them. But sometimes that's not possible due to things like disfigurement or decomposition, etc., or absence of the head, sometimes is the case. So other forms of identification need to be done. This may be anything from fingerprints, from, if the head is there, then dental records, tissues for DNA and matching it to other specimens, determining the cause of death, which is usually the main aim of the autopsy, and to obtain or retrieve relevant evidence from the body. So if somebody has been shot and there's a bullet retained in the body, then that bullet would be removed, not under the Inquest Act, because it's not necessarily determining the cause of death, but under the Criminal Procedures Act allows a policeman to request specimens that are relevant to a case to be obtained. And it's a multi-stage process. While it's true that in most circumstances, certainly in the South African situation, where we do rather a lot of medical legal autopsies, as you can see from the Salt River figures, the typical working day at a mortuary like Salt River, there'd be anywhere between 4 and 6 pathologists working, doing on average 3 cases each in a day. So it's relatively busy, and what would be an ideal investigation, and may occur in countries with much lower rates of unnatural deaths, would start at a scene of death investigation. But as pathologists, we go to relatively few scenes of death in our situation here in South Africa, because we simply don't have the time with a number of cases. It's left largely up to the police at the scene to determine whether they call us or not, although our part of forensic pathology officers are individuals who are employed in the forensic pathology service to do a variety of functions. They assist us in the post-mortem examination by, for example, getting bodies out of the fridge, positioning the bodies. Some of them are trained dissectors, and they assist us in those processes. Others are involved in going to scenes of death to collect the body, but we've now given them extra skills, upskilled them so that they're not only drivers who just go and pick up a body and load it, and then they also now will give us some information about the scene. So they will do sketches of the scene, they'll take notes, they'll interview people on the scene, they'll take photographs of the scene, and all that gives us invaluable information when we're doing, as pathologists now, doing the autopsy examination. So although we're not going to most scenes of death, we do get quite a lot of scene of death information. We then review what information is available, and then go on to examine the body. Some pathologists are of the opinion that one shouldn't review information beforehand, that you should go into the autopsy with a completely blank slate and not knowing what the history is, and look at it completely objectively. I'm not one of those that agrees with that. I believe the more information you can have beforehand, the more meaningful your examination can be. So then I'm to examining the body, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and special investigations and generation of a report. So at the scene, there are various types of scenes that one might encounter. Some of them can be quite challenging from just accessibility. So that is a light aircraft crash in the mountains, so you required people with mountaineering skills to actually get there, or a helicopter to fly you up there. But the scene again can give you valuable information as to position of bodies in the aircraft, relationship to the crash. Probably can't see too much detail there, so I didn't want to show you too much of my gruesome bodies. This is a body found lying under a bridge on some cardboard. if you look closely there, you'll see you can't see the head, and the reason you can't see the head is because he's been decapitated. But there's no blood around there, so that certainly gives you some information that he wasn't killed at the place where the body was found. Even motor vehicle collisions, information can be gleaned from reviewing the scene of the collision. This, for those of you who know, was a showroom where all the fancy imported cars, the Ferraris and Lamborghinis and that in Cape Town, and this car managed to crash into there. But there were 4 unidentified bodies besides the occupants of the vehicle that were found, and they were actually homeless street people who were sleeping on the pavement over here, and when the car crashed, killed them as well. Domestic deaths, in this case a hanging. It's always important in hangings to determine whether it's compatible with a suicide, or did somebody string the person up after they killed them in some other way. Hangings that occur in police detention, which occur from time to time, they are scenes that we tend to visit as pathologists because of the importance of determining that it was a suicide. Establishing the time of death is one of the most common reasons that the police ask us to come to scenes, because once the body's been brought to the mortuary, particularly when it's been put in the fridge, that then renders any estimation of time of death, certainly in recent deaths, as being impossible. If it's a body that's decomposed or skeletonized, one can use the rate of decomposition or skeletalization to give an estimate. But in a body in the first 24, 48 hours or so, one relies largely on temperature changes. This is a quote from Bernard Knight, who is a doyen of UK forensic pathologists, in his textbook, that the time of death is sometimes extremely important. It's a question almost invariably asked by police officers, sometimes with a touching faith in the accuracy of the estimate. Determining the time of death is extremely difficult, and accuracy is impossible. We can only ever, at best, unless you actually witness the death, give an estimate, and probably the narrowest window we can give is a window of about 4 hours. If you go be more accurate than that, then you really are just guessing. Even that is an estimate, because there are just so many variables that one has to take into account. So, although we do try and give estimates of time of death when asked, they are usually much broader than the police are happy with. They would very much like to tell us that this person died at 10:27. Well, it's unfortunately just not possible. As far as reviewing available information, of course, we should be getting reports from the police, although often it's extremely scanty. I was just looking, I've got some cases scheduled for tomorrow morning, and looking at one which was a gang-related shooting, and looking at the police report, there's one word. It says, shot. So, very helpful to me. Okay, the report from our forensic pathology officers who went to the scene is slightly more useful, and they've given me some photographs. Statements from the family can be useful, particularly when one's investigating deaths that are the sort of sudden unexpected category of deaths. Medical records also in those, or hospital cases. And media reports are sometimes quite useful. Sometimes we read more about the case in the morning newspaper than we get information from the police. As far as examination of the body goes, well, the clothing in forensic examinations, the clothing in the external examination is very often the most important part of the examination, because that can give us information about the type of wounds that inflict, the type of weapons involved, range of weapon. For example, if it's a gunshot, how close was that shot? The internal examination, in many cases, gives us comparatively little information over and above what we can determine from the external examination. But there are occasions in which we get surprises. So there are a couple of instances in which we won't proceed to do an internal examination. One is if we, through radiography and doing an X-ray examination, this is a machine called a low-dose exemplar, which is a low-dose X-ray machine developed initially for De Beers to screen workers as they were leaving the mines for diamonds, but then became used in casualty departments, trauma departments, and hospitals. And then our mortuary, our former head of department, Professor Dion Knobel, was the first to utilize the precursor of this machine in a forensic mortuary, and they have now become the most popular form of radiographic examination in mortuaries around the world. Extremely useful. You can do a full body X-ray it takes about 18 seconds to do the full body scan, and gives us invaluable information. So sometimes we'll get a body that there are no suspicious circumstances, but they were just found dead, so there's nobody to be able to give a death notification form. We do an X-ray and we find evidence of natural disease, either a massive heart and fluid on lungs, or fulminant tuberculosis, which is, as you know, very prevalent in the Western Cape. In those circumstances, our examination will stop there, and it'll be comprised simply an external examination and a radiographic examination. Sometimes where there's a major risk to the staff in the mortuary involved, so somebody who has, for example, if we know them to have multi-drug resistant pneumonia, tuberculosis at least, and they've been murdered, we need to do an examination, but we may do a limited autopsy if we can avoid opening the chest if they've been shot in the head, and we avoid opening the chest because of the health risks to the staff involved, then it's justified in those circumstances. But in general, a full internal examination, which involves removing all the organs and dissecting each organ individually, looking for things like wound tracks, looking for the effects on organ systems by the trauma, looking for underlying pathology, etc., is done as standard practice. And then, depending on the case, specimens or exhibits we retain. These may be diagnostics, in other words, to help formulate that cause of death. So amongst the common things we do is to take histology. So just as if you go to a doctor and you've got a little suspicious skin lesion, you might take a biopsy of that and send it to the pathologist to look under the microscope. So we would do the same sometimes with skin lesions, but we can do it in organs that the physician dealing with a living patient finds much more difficult to do. So we can easily take biopsies of the brain and the heart and things like that, examine that under the microscope. Sometimes we retain whole organs for reasons of, for example, the brain can be a difficult organ to examine in detail in the fresh state because it's very jelly-like and soft and difficult to cut and dissect, and especially in children. So if we have, for example, a child abuse, child homicide case, where often the mechanism of death involves brain injury through shaken baby syndrome, etc., you may see very little in looking at the brain in the fresh state. So we retain the brain and we fix it. In other words, we firm it up by putting it in a bucket of formalin for a couple of weeks, and then it becomes much more useful to examine it. The heart may be retained to examine conducting systems, etc., in the heart. It's not the routine, not the norm, but it does happen on occasions so that organs are retained. Specimens for toxicology, so in cases where poisoning or some form of toxin is suspected, or where we simply have no idea what's caused the death. So then you're looking for hidden causes, which may involve taking toxicology. So that may be blood, urine, eye fluid. Sometimes we use because it's if the blood has drained away or decomposed, eye fluid can sometimes be more protected. Other tissues like nails, hairs, looking for drugs of abuse. Microbiology, so we may take swabs and look for culture of organisms. Biochemistry, for the most part, is not of value post-mortem because the changes in the body are so profound. But there are some things that are still useful. We can look at kidney function, blood sugar. If after death, your blood sugar level drops extremely rapidly. So if you were to die of low blood sugar, doing a post-mortem level is not really going to help us, because everybody will have a low blood sugar. But if your blood sugar post-mortem is high, then it means it was very, very high before you died. So that can be of use. And then genetic studies, looking at more and more diseases that we know of a genetic basis, and there are more and more genetic tests almost by the day that are becoming available to screen for these conditions. Other forms of post-mortem specimens are more evidentiary, not related to diagnosing the cause of death, but as I mentioned, somebody's been shot and the bullet is retained in the body, then that bullet is of great value to the police, to the ballistics unit, to try and match it to a weapon, for example. Similarly, clothing can be of use, DNA to match blood on the suspect's clothing or on a knife, etc. Again, toxicology, not all toxicology screening is for the cause of death, but may be related to the circumstances of the death. So somebody who dies of a head injury in a motor vehicle collision, their blood alcohol level is not relevant to their final cause of death, but may well be relevant to the circumstances that led to that. And then various foreign materials that may be found. Who may be present at an autopsy? This is laid down by law. Obviously, the practitioner performing the autopsy has to be there, and the forensic pathology officer who's authorized to be there. The manager of the facility is allowed to be present because he needs to be able to inspect the facility. The investigating police officer has a right to be there, and we certainly appreciate it when we have police officers, the investigating officer there, because they can give us information, and we likewise can feed them with information rather than having to track them down afterwards to inform them about the case. Unfortunately, only about the attendance rate of investigating officers at Salt River Mortuary is in the region of about 40%. Although there's a standing police order that all investigating officers must attend all post-mortems. But there are circumstances where they have to be in court, or sometimes the investigating officer only gets changed and only gets appointed after the event. A medical practitioner representing a person with a material interest. So anybody who has a material interest in that death, it's usually be the next of kin. They may appoint a medical practitioner to be present at the autopsy, not to do the autopsy, but to witness it and represent their interests. People who die as a result of police action, who are shot by the police, for example, families are under the misapprehension that we as forensic pathologists work for the police, and they're often very suspicious about our motives when we do the case. Sometimes patients who die in hospitals and malpractice is suspected, again, because we work for the Department of Health. Sometimes families think that we're going to try and hide the truth. But it's certainly within their rights to appoint a practitioner to attend, and I personally have no problems with that happening. It doesn't happen very often, but from time to time it does happen. And then either the practitioner performing the post-mortem or the magistrate who's authorized it can allow any other person to attend the post-mortem within their discretion. So we, for example, have medical students who attend our post-mortems as part of their training, and so we're required to give them permission to do that. Establishing the cause of death is, in most circumstances, fortunately pretty straightforward and quite easy, but largely because of the type of the large amount of trauma that we see in our population. So traumatic deaths, the cause of death in most circumstances is fairly evident. But there are problem areas. I did mention this earlier about, thought I'd have a hang of this by now. The importance of history, and the classic medical approach to making a diagnosis is history, examination, special investigations. And when I was a medical student, I remember being taught that 80% of the diagnosis relies on the history. And it may not be quite 80% in post-mortems, but it's it can be an extremely important part. The examination, of course, would be the post-mortem itself and special investigations, depending on the type that we see. Some of the problem areas, the so-called negative autopsy. It's the autopsy where very often it's a person that's died of fairly vague symptoms or no symptoms at all, or no real history. You do the autopsy, and at the end of it, you put your scalpel down and you think, I have absolutely no idea why this person has died. Everything looks completely normal to me. And so that can be a real challenge. Because of the preponderance, the large number of traumatic cases we see, we have a much lower so-called negative autopsy rate than, for example, a pathologist working in Western Europe or the UK would have. They work in about a 5 to 10% acceptable negative autopsy rate. Ours is probably less than 1%. But those then require, you need to throw lots of other investigations at it, and that's where things like doing full toxicology examinations, full histology, more and more nowadays genetic studies, and even after all that, there's still going to be a proportion of cases where you just do not know why that person has died. You may speculate and you may guess to an extent, but there are always going to be a certain number of cases that you just cannot establish a cause of death. Decomposed and skeletalized bodies, see, they present challenges of their own. If you have a skeleton of somebody who was stabbed in the heart, you're obviously not going to see that. You might be lucky and see little incised notches on the ribs, and you can think, well, it possibly was a stab wound and would be close to the heart, and you can speculate. But it's very often in those sort of cases you cannot determine a precise cause of death. And then procedure-related deaths, people who die, particularly after surgical procedures, complex procedures like cardiac surgery that may be difficult to interpret. Often patients who die after anesthetics or during hospitalization may die because of changes in their metabolic systems, by chemical changes, which can be very difficult to diagnose after death. So those are some of the major sort of problem areas that we face. I don't want to go into the cause or mechanism, manner of death, just to say that unlike in some Americans and the states that have medical examiner systems, there the medical examiner will determine what we call the manner of death. That's the circumstances of death. So they would say that Michael Jackson died of propofol overdose and his manner of death was homicidal. If he had died here, we would hopefully have found the same cause of death, the propofol overdose, but we'd have left it at there. It would be up to the court to decide the manner of death and say that whether somebody was to blame or not. So we don't make that determination. We don't determine that somebody died of a suicide or of an accident or of a homicide. That's for the court to decide. We provide them information that they use to help to make that determination, but we don't make that determination. The post-mortem report is the end result of our investigation, and that's what we submit to the courts, and in most circumstances that's the end of the matter. And of course in some cases we will get called to give evidence verbally in court as well, but I'm not going to speak further on that. Just the last thing is to say, what is the future of the autopsies? Are autopsies still relevant? Well, I certainly believe they are. There are alternatives, and particularly the so-called vertopsy, which was initiated in Switzerland. A number of countries around the world are now performing the so-called vertopsy, which is a radiological imaging of the body and doing the examination based on images like this, where MRI scans. They can provide very detailed examination of things like wound tracks, so you can see exactly where the knife has gone.